Hello, everyone. Anybody not in the last session? It was pretty great, wasn't it? Yeah. I'm going to steal and plagiarize liberally from it. That was a coincidence, but there's some motifs from that are really resonant, I think, and hopefully I can weave them into the comments here. That's advertising. So here's what we're going to talk about. Given that this is sometimes an exercise of preaching to the converted, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the trends that we all know intimately, right? Volume, velocity, variety, variability. Those things have been talked to quite a lot over the conference spectrum for years. It's replete in the literature, so I'm not going to bore you with that. What I'm going to try and pivot to is a way of looking at this problem a little more philosophically, and a way of hopefully giving you something to take back to your organizations to tell the story that we all believe in a little bit different light and perhaps a more compelling light. So I will cover some market trends. I'll gloss past those. We'll touch on the legal and regulatory risks just to make sure we're level set. And then what we'll do is we'll talk about why companies struggle with this, why organizations, commercial and public, struggle with these things. And then the benefit of a unifying approach. And as we talked about, I think for those who have been here for the whole time, there are themes running through every panel discussion that I've been a part of, every keynote that I've been a part of, that I'll try and weave into this. So to frame the issue, again, I don't need to teach or preach to you good folks about data proliferation. I do want to point out that as the proliferation expands, the storage costs continue. And the reason that's important for this audience in this context is that for years, the drumbeat has been in the records and information management and information governance circles about compliance, right? And that agenda has been stymied by these two trends: growing data, lower cost of data. So what? Well, typically these things fell to the CIO to figure out. And the CIO, faced with a very difficult choice between engaging in a career-limiting, cat-herding exercise to unify a bunch of C-suite executives on information governance or buy more storage, had a pretty easy call. So for 20 years, the unit cost of storage has been dropping, and for 20 years, this decision, arguably more if you heard the tales from the crypt from the 90s ERP thing that Richard gave yesterday, those things are really coming home to roost in big ways. Notably, the legislation that we've seen for the last 15 years, from Sarbanes-Oxley up to present-day GDPR concerns, and we'll talk about some of those things. Combine that with event-driven things like litigation, regulatory inquiries, whistleblower emails, and things that provoke a concerted effort from organizations, and you're now confounded by the fact that you have a very tightly limited timeline with incredibly obscene deadlines, and this kind of volume that hasn't been indexed or searched or usefully stored for a period of a decade or more. And for all these reasons, e-discovery and regulatory compliance has become expensive and unpredictable. And survey after survey, I think for the last 7 years running, the COGC surveys have said that the confidence levels in the ability to respond timely, and by timely, that used to mean within a week and is now measured in a month, to respond to these inquiries, the confidence levels by practitioners continues to drop year over year. So unstructured data, big part of this problem. 78% of organizations believe that this would improve markedly. You talk to e-discovery practitioners, they have their doubts, right? Better than half, 70 cents on every dollar, is wasted in e-discovery efforts because there's very little signal to distill from the noise. If you take these two level-setting slides and you weave it into Anand's presentation, I think the underlying reason for this disconnect is because most of what we've been doing as information governance practitioners has been below the flow. We have a very good message. We're not irrelevant to the situation, but we haven't been operating in the sphere of influence or attention span of the executives who make the decision. We've been relying on outlier use cases to scare people into thoughts and proclivities of compliance, but we haven't been integrating our messaging into the reason that our organizations exist. We haven't been embracing the culture. So if you think about Governor Raimondo's comments from last night and Anand's comments about what your organizations are designed to do, and you think about the compliance drumbeat, which has been the traditional approach to our world, it's no wonder that we're not getting the attention or the credibility as practitioners that we honestly deserve. I believe the insights coming out of this community for 10 years have been spot on, and yet the adoption rates do not reflect that. And so if you take nothing else away from this talk, I hope that you take the fact that, and I think there was a dual slide in Anand's presentation where he talked about the key concerns of executives, that communicating the strategy is hampered by cultural phenomena, right? As Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for lunch. Well, I think it's important for information governance perspective and professionals to look at the culture of your respective organizations and to integrate those messages into ways that align with that strategy, not combat it. Because I think that's what's been happening for 10 or 15 years. I think we've been below the flow and the credibility isn't there yet. Everyone's seen some version of this slide, no doubt. What's different today about information governance in particular is that I think there's beginning to be some doubt as to whether the 70% dross or digital landfill or whatever colorful metaphor you want to use is really true. The nature of machine learning, the nature of artificial intelligence, the nature of abilities that are represented by some of the vendors in this hall make possible for us to not only get a handle on these things and see if this pie chart is reflective of our enterprise information stores, but to challenge those breakdowns as well. How many of you are dealing in some way with the GDPR regulation or any wide sweeping information privacy regulation? Okay, so a good part. For those that are not aware of the compulsion there, by May of next year, if you're processing data for EU citizens, you must be compliant with that law. In many ways, the GDPR is for information governance professionals what Sarbanes-Oxley was for internal auditors. It is going to raise the profile of privacy and IG practitioners globally like no other legislation that's been before it. The one boon, the one benefit that companies can get from this is that it will force them to wade into this swamp. It will force them to enumerate the categories of those breakdowns. And if they do it really well, and here's the kicker for alignment with your company's strategy, it may allow you yet to find new ways to monetize that 70%. It may allow you to identify patterns and usages and other alternative uses for things that you thought were just on the shelf gathering dust. So if you think about the tools you've already acquired to solve, say, an e-discovery agenda, why not repurpose it for a different objective? Why not use that same technology and that same mentality of tranching data by risk categories to address a privacy agenda or a compliance agenda or the GDPR gambit? So that repurposing and the discipline of information governance perspective professionals allows us to go into this with a different frame of reference. And more importantly, I think this GDPR aspect is particularly cogent for this. It allows us to tell our respective organizations that the default must pivot. The default must pivot from keep because I can to delete unless I can articulate a reason not to. And I know that's preaching to the choir here. But the reality of it is, with the advent of new software like Facebook for Work, or what's it called? Workplace. That's a new container. That's a new trove that is not out of reach of the regulators or opposing counsel or anybody that's in a foreign jurisdiction that may find it relevant. So if you're not careful as a function of policy and defensible deletion over time, you're just creating a new, potentially more casual recording of things you may not want to keep. So that aspect of the default, which you heard Anand talk about, which is going to be as the admin to store everything, should be challenged. Now, maybe there's the utility in that for certain things as a bot. And there may be patterns and trends, usages, frequency of questions for the CEO to address, all good things that speak to strategy. But as we talked about, culture eats strategy for lunch. So as the matrix organization shrinks, as the hierarchies disappear or dissipate, the data still grow. So we have to challenge the thinking about whether that in itself is a good idea. The penalties for not getting that right are dire, right? In an e-discovery context alone, they can range from bet the company, case dismissed kind of stakes to eminently more expensive stages along the way. How many here are familiar with the concept of adverse inference jury instruction? Okay. So simply put, for those that are not familiar, you argue your entire case, you're unable to introduce evidence, and just before the jury steps out for its deliberations, the judge says, just a second. You as the jury are free to draw a negative inference about the backup tape they couldn't produce because they couldn't produce it, which is akin to saying, opposing counsel just met its burden, good luck with your deliberations, right? So it's a horrible turn of events. Now that's if you can't find the data. But in my world, which is typically reactive in nature and a forensic capacity, the reasons for being unable to find something are not usually because it wasn't recorded. It's because it was recorded with so much other crap. And we just don't have the time to get to what could have been a perfect affirmative defense of the case because we have to sift through so much other noise. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's try and reframe the issue a little bit. How many philosophy majors in the audience? Don't be shy. Good. Thank God. I'm not the only one. Really? Any lawyers in the audience? No philosophy? Just one. Okay. So in the school, in philosophical systems, metaphysics talks about the nature of reality. Epistemology talks about how we know about the nature of reality. In the 17th century, there was a series of studies done on animals to see what philosophers call unit economy. You may remember this. How many fixed items can a given intelligence or conscience focus on and hold close? And there was a study done with crows where 3 men would enter a wood, the crows would scatter, stop cawing, and then when the 3 men would leave, they'd return and go about their business. When 5 men would come in, they would scatter and return. 5 men leave, they'd return. When 7 men went into the forest and 4 left, the crows would return, even though there were still 3 men in the wood. And what philosophers use this metaphor to explain is that there's a finite number of things that a crow can hold firm in his or her conscience. Organizations are exactly the same. And if you're not unifying on those select few things that are deeply and inextricably aligned with the organizational strategy, if you cannot dovetail your message around information governance into that one of 3 or 4 fixed things that an organization truly focuses on, and I would argue that that's its culture, then you're going to be swimming against the stream. So that flow diagram you remember from Anand's presentation, it's a beautiful metaphor. Because if you can catch the attention of the people who control or at least can recognize what's the flow for your organization, you're going to be able to adopt this message that it should be a delete by default proposition, or we should have a conversation about onboarding a new technology that's going to create a vast new repository. Does that make sense? So the Crow epistemology, if nothing else, is just about focusing on those things that you know to be immutably true for your organization. It may be intentional, it may happen by default. So whether it happens by design or default isn't the point. What's true for your organization's strategy? What is it trying to accomplish? Why is it in business? If you're a nonprofit, why do you exist? Who are you serving? What are you doing? And does IG layer into that today? And the usual answer is no. We're seen often as a necessary evil. I know as a forensic geek, I am definitely a necessary evil. People are not thrilled to see me, right? The flares in the air, something horrible has at least been alleged, if not happened, right? So I have some credibility on the heels of a data breach investigation to point out things that would make that exercise less painful next time. But you all are in the breach every day, focusing on the advent of new data, the sunsetting of old systems, the decommissioning that happens in between. And it's at those key inflection points that you should be speaking up. It's in the day-to-day course of that business where you can see the daylight between strategy and practice, or worse, policy and practice, that we have to give voice to those things and make sure that we're doing it in a way that doesn't violate the Crow epistemology. One of my favorite quotes from Justice Jackson here happened in the early 50s. So this is a very famous Supreme Court case. But think about that. 1953. Think about what discovery looked like for this case. It was very likely 20 or 30 banker's boxes full of stuff. A banker's box holds about 2,500 pages of data. All in, it's probably about 7 to 9 megabytes of content. Today, I think the average footprint of an enterprise doubles less than every 18 months. I'd ask you, you probably have those metrics off the top of your head, right? That is breathtaking. And so you are likely to be so focused on the tactical aspects of having to address that proliferation and that management issue that you're not even at the table, perhaps, when these new technologies are onboarded. So I hope that's helpful perspective. So we've talked about data as an asset. We've talked about data as a liability. Hopefully I've given you some thoughts about a way to think about changing the game with the Crow epistemology. This model is wonderful. I love it. It's not, I don't get paid to say that. But the important thing for you to take away is that a framework, any framework, is going to be useful only if it aligns with your actual organizational culture. Hope that makes sense. One of the things that we see very often is a disconnect in at least some of the bullets on this point. The policies, the procedures. I'll leave this up there. These are in the materials. And hopefully I've given you some way of looking at and hopefully reframing the issue that you deal with regularly. Thank you very much.